delighted to have Secretary Gordon up here with us. He's a 1979 graduate of the Military Academy at West Point. Went out and was a highly successful field artillery officer in the United States Army, and then came to the Woodrow Wilson School in 1987. He helped coach me through microeconomics when I came to the Woodrow Wilson School in 1988, and then left here to teach up at the Military Academy at West Point. Then was an exceptional operations officer out at Fort Carson, Colorado, returning to West Point to become the director of the American Politics program at West Point before retiring in 2006, where he went to be the vice president of people and programs for City Year until the Obama administration called him in the midst of the war. One of the most important things that we can do is take care of soldiers. And as General Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the Army, says, the strength of the nation is its army, the strength of the army is its soldiers, the strength of the soldiers are its families. And so they needed one person with passion, intelligence, desire, and who's finished WWS 501 to be able to manage the military community and family policy for the entire Department of Defense. And he'll describe to you what all that is, and that's Secretary Rob Gordon. It's a great honor to have you here, sir.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Mike.
Hi, everybody.
This will probably be a little different because, you know, I am responsible for the military community and our families, our children, our active duty service members and their education. Fascinating portfolio. We're going to get into that in a minute. But you students of the WU, here is a WU. I can tell you your education stands you in good stead. Let me tell you about that. I always remember the days of then Professor Chris Paxson, who used to teach me 511B, in fact, and I would come out of Professor Grossman's class wondering what he said exactly, and then Professor Paxson would tell me what he said. So I have fond memories of being a WU back in the late 80s, and I'm just delighted that she is now the dean. I come across WUs all the time, basically down in Washington, D.C., doing many things, but in general focused on the nation, in service to the nation. That's what we do. And what I can tell you is your education will stand you in good stead. I hope once you finish it that you get up there and carry the mantle of in service to the nation, because many WUs are doing that at this period of time. Been a fascinating journey for me. You know, I've been in this, I call it a passion, for 19 months, interestingly enough. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is just the art of public policy, the application of it. And some concepts that we struggle with as WUs, you know, as we look at the theoretical and framework underpinnings of public policy, and then the practice of it. Let me put up a few things before I get to my presentation here. One is like normative versus positive. We used to talk about this a lot at the WU, and the whole idea is what ought government do versus what does government do. What ought the Department of Defense do for its military community? Well, let me give you a fact. 70% of our military community, millions, right? Over 2 million service members, 2.06 million children, 2 million families, 1.2 million military-connected children in education, some sort of educational delivery system across the world, right? Big numbers. 70% of our military community lives off installation. People don't know that. They think that the military community is actually on our installations across the world. Fort Carson, Colorado, Peterson Air Force Base. 70% live off installation in our broader community. And so this notion of caring for and supporting our military community, empowering them to contribute in the future, ensuring that they are ready for the defense of the nation. What ought the Defense Department do in terms of caring for, supporting, and empowering? Is there a larger sort of responsibility on the part of the broader community? We're struggling with that issue right now. We're trying to get this right now. Let me give you another one that we talk about a lot. policy versus operations. What should the Office of the Secretary of Defense do? Are we just policymakers, or should we be involved in operations? You're going to see in my deputy, think of this organization as a part of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. We do both. There's certain operational aspects that the services carry out, but there's certain things that my office does. Perfect example is I have military family life counselors. Think of behavioralists and psychologists and sociologists, 40,000 available to deploy anywhere in the world on the part of a commander who wants to assist his or her community in non-medical counseling for a temporary period of time. We have over 1,000 of them deployed now. Usually either pre-deployment, before service members are deployed into areas of conflict, or post-deployment, once they come back to help with that non-medical counseling. I directly run that. Should I? Should the Office of Secretary of Defense do it? Or should this be the charge of the services to do? What should we consolidate, basically, in the department? And again, what should the services be responsible for? So you can see there's not a lot of normative aspects to what we struggle with in ensuring not only the defense of the country, but that we're caring for and supporting and empowering our service members and their families. The military is very different from when I came in, when Colonel Meese came in as well, when we had 70% of our military community actually on installation. We've been at war now for 10 years. Service members have been deployed up to 6 times, in fact. In, and out. The burden of families, of course, have been felt during that period of time. And so we have endeavored to be innovative and very thoughtful about managing our families and caring for them during this 10 years of war. As we all know in the room, an inflection point is about to happen. Pulled out of Iraq, sooner or later out of Afghanistan, we'll have a bow wave of service members and their families returning to their communities across the country. We are beginning to prepare for that. And as you know, there will be budget cuts over the next 10 years of roughly $480 billion. How do we think about those sorts of things as well over 10 years as we reduce the budget size of the Department of Defense, yet continue to care for, support, and empower our military community? Okay, just want to get a few things out there. I don't want to spend too much time on the slides because I like a lot of discussion and back and forth. What I plan to cover very quickly, because I know the class and Colonel Meese have already covered, for example, DoD organization, and we'll talk about that through my organization, Military, Community, and Family Policy. We'll take a look at that portfolio too, so you get a sense of what is in MC and FP right here. Change the mission, vision, and values. Something I brought basically to my passion, I call it passion instead of a job because it is a passion, is this notion of strategic imperatives. I want to leave you with those, and we can discuss those too, because that's the lens through which we do basically our work. We'll take a look at some of the high priority initiatives, and since I'm a woo, it's all about issue networks. We'll talk about issue networks that I deal with. And then we're going to get to 2 case studies. And I want to get to these fairly quickly. One is public schools and military installations. I'm going to talk you through that. It's something I actually knew very little of, even though I spent years in the military. It's an educational delivery system that's separate from the Department of Defense education activity, which is a collection, the DODIA is called, are DOD-run schools. 194 of them across the world with 87,000 students. There's another system as well, and we'll talk through the policy of that as a case study. And then, if we've got enough time, I'll talk about the Military Spouse Employment Partnership. We've got 1.2 million spouses, 26% unemployment, 25% wage gap. What do we do about that? And we did something about it, and I'll talk you through the policy process there as well. Okay, let's get started. And I will leave, I hope, plenty of time for questions to the Department of Defense. And what I wanted to show you here is, of course, you students of Colonel Meese's class. And by the way, before I begin, I just let you students know, the highest ranking social sciences person in the entire world is Colonel Mike Meese. He is the head of the Department of Social Sciences, a higher rank than 4-star generals. That's right, General Petraeus. General Petraeus preceded me. You know, I sent Mike some things, he sent me some things. He sent me books, you know, economics books, told me to get with it before I even got here, in fact. But I will tell you, when the head of the Department of Social Sciences calls upon anyone who is a social alum, we say, yes, sir, roger out, and we deliver. Isn't that true? You're here. Just so you know. This is an important man that you are taking your courses from. Not only is he brilliant, but I'll say yes, sir, whatever you need. Now, let's take a look, basically, at the Department of Defense. Secretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary, the military departments, as you can see to your left, the JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, to your right. Here is the Office of Secretary of Defense, where you find the Undersecretaries and the Assistant Secretaries and the Deputy Assistant Secretaries Civilian. This is about civilian-military control at the end of the day. And these are civilians who work here and defense equivalents. We also have a number of field activities and agencies. The only big difference between the two is that activities tend to be more narrowly focused, and agencies, in fact, can be broader. I'm going to talk about 3 of those that are in military, community, and family policy. DODEA, the Department of Defense Education Activities, our schools. DECA, that's our commissary system, the Defense Commissary Agency. We have, think of commissaries, for those of you who don't know, as grocery stores. And we have roughly 250 of those large grocery stores and satellite stores across the world. Fascinating, run by a CEO, civilian, interestingly enough. We also have exchanges. Think of shopping centers. We have 3 different exchange systems. The biggest is AFES, the Army and Air Force exchange system, $10.5 billion enterprise, has to make a profit. Money for AFES does not come from Congress, is not appropriated. So it's a non-appropriated fund agency, and it's currently run by a 2-star, but we are also converting those CEO positions to civilians, once again. So these are agencies and activities. And then, the Armed Forces Retirement Home. 2 retirement homes here in the United States, used to be the old Army and Navy homes. Roughly 1,000 veterans are in those homes. One in Washington, D.C., the other in Biloxi, Mississippi, run by a chief operating officer through a trust fund appropriated by Congress, interestingly enough. So that gives you an idea of some examples of the activities and agencies. And here you see the combatant commands, the war fighters. You see Central Command and the others as well. Of course, General Petraeus used to be the CENTCOM commander, General Abizaid as well. Now, back to the Office of Secretary of Defense. Let's drill down there a little bit more. You see here, within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, there are the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Undersecretaries. Everyone from the Undersecretary of Policy to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. And that's where military, community, and family policy sits, along with a number of agencies. Once again, we have DECA up here that I just explained, General Counsel, we have Legal Services, but here we have the deputates and the Assistant Secretaries. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military, Community, and Family Policy. We have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Wounded Warrior Care and Transition Policy. We have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military Personnel Policy. We have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Civilian Personnel Policy. And we have Assistant Secretaries, 4-star general equivalents. My position is a 3.5-star flag equivalent. Are Assistant Secretaries of Health Affairs, $52 billion enterprise, for example. Our Assistant Secretary of Reserve Affairs. All of those are in the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Let's drill down a little bit more, and you see the military departments. We work with civilians, the Assistant Secretary of Manpower and Reserve Affairs for the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. Depending on the issue, sometimes the Marines will have their own separate department. But here, and I mainly deal with the Deputy Assistant Secretaries of Defense for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. The Navy and the Marines come under that Manpower and Reserve umbrella. Sometimes they do some things separately, sometimes they come under the same umbrella. So these are the individuals I deal with in terms of policy and operations. I do deal with the military departments as well, depending on what the issue is, but again, you can see it is quite the network of both military and civilian leadership as we deal with policy issues. Let's take a look at military, community, and family policy. Oftentimes I've found that it's hard to find an org chart. So I want to provide you one to take a look at what we look like. That's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. This is called a deputate at the end of the day. Really interesting sort of arcane word, deputate. And you can see the different departments that are here. I do have a principal director, think in terms of a chief operating officer, running those trains, planes, and automobiles. Comes from the Air Force, Mr. Chuck Milam. That's a 2-star equivalent position. I'm a military assistant, a senior advisor, strategist. And then let's take a look at what we have underneath. Everything from family policy, children and youth, morale, welfare, and recreation, lodges, and recreation facilities will be there. Resale, that's where you find DECA, the commissary system I talked about, and the exchanges. It's called resale. Policy. State liaison. Interestingly enough, I have a staff of 10 who go out and interface with governor's offices and state legislative bodies to advocate for the military community. A perfect example is children who move from state to state in high schools and elementary and middle schools who might find their education disrupted because, for example, there are certain administrative requirements that are different. It could be that requirements for graduation from high school are different. And what my team does is it will go out on an issue like that, work with states to smooth out the disruption. We do that in terms of what we call the Compact for our military children. 40 of 50 states have signed the compact to, again, minimize disruption and empower military children as they move from state to state to state. The state liaison group basically deals with those issues. Here as well are educational opportunities. This is for active duty service members. It's called voluntary education or tuition assistance. We have roughly $500 million that courses through the veins of education for our active duty military members. We have roughly 325,000 who are taking courses right now on ships and submarines as they are doing their mission, but they're getting associate's degrees and master's degrees and bachelor's degrees. Takes them longer because they're doing their mission, sometimes up to 8 to 10 years. But they are moving through that system. That tuition assistance is right here, and I have policy oversight for that. I ensure a uniform policy. The services actually run their own tuition assistance programs, and they can have different rules of the game. What I bring to it in my staff is ensuring uniformity and fairness at the end of the day. And we work with the colleges and universities too. MOS, counseling, 40,000 military family life counselors. And I can deploy those worldwide. And as I said, I have over 1,000 deployed right now. You also find Military One Source, very large, interactive, 24/7, 365-day website for military community to tap into. For everything from non-medical counseling to financial counseling to assistance with moving, they can also do that online. It's called Military One Source. It's contracted out, in fact. I have the Office of Families with Special Needs here as well. And we could have roughly over 300,000 individuals, children and adults with special needs. We have a special office, just been stood up about 1.5 years ago. Dr. Rebecca Pasante runs it, although the director by law is the principal director, Mr. Chuck Milam. The deputy director is actually Dr. Pasante. But by law, principal director, PD, actually is the director for this office as well. Mortuary and casualty affairs. this is where you find dignified transfer. So if a service member dies or falls anywhere in the world in terms of transferring the remains back to the family, we have the policy oversight for that as well. It occurs at Dover Air Force Base, and the Air Force actually is the executive agent. Let me mention a little bit about executive agents. It could be, for example, that we have a policy on something, let's say dignified transfer. And oftentimes we'll get one of the services to be the executive agent and operationally run that program or that initiative, and it not be the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And it gets into the normative. You know, what should, for example, the Office of the Secretary of Defense do versus the services themselves. Something new. This, by the way, is budget. She's great. I have a budget person here. I have legislative assistants as well. I deal with the Hill quite a bit, as you might imagine. But this is new policy integration. I call it the fit cell. And the whole idea here was we weren't really organized to look out into the future from a strategic standpoint. So this is brand new, and we are just staffing this up. It is a fit cell of strategists and analysts to look at issues that we will be dealing with in the future. Perfect example, as we move our military community back into the broader community across this country. How do we think about the policy and the analytical aspects of that? That fit cell will be basically the bevy of analysts and strategists who basically devise a strategy that we can then share with and tinker with the services so that we can be better at caring for and empowering our community. That is military community and family policy. Being the visual person that I am, I decided to also put this visually for you. In fact, and at the center is our military community and family policy. Active duty on the upper arc, reserves on the lower arc. You can see, for example, roughly a little over 2 million service members, roughly about 3 million family members, 1.2 million spouses, 2 million children. And now you can see some of the initiatives and programs, basically, that we deal with and that we oversee. You see morale, welfare, and recreation. I'm going to start on the upper right there. 11,000 plus installations across the world, fitness centers, libraries, food and beverage. We've got roughly 66,000 employees there. Exceptional family member, I talked about that. Our commissaries, 17,000 employees, roughly 250 stores. Our exchanges, we have 300 basically main exchanges, but you can see over 5,000 retail outlets. A lot of employees, 61,000 employees. State liaison group I talked about. Armed Forces Retirement Home. Casualty assistance. Family advocacy. We do deal with child neglect and abuse as well in terms of our families. Children and youth support. 350 youth centers, but take a look at the number of child development centers. 953 child development centers. 200,000 children coursing through the veins of that system. We're doing more, by the way, to outreach now to our civilian community to assist with that, since most of our community lives off installation once again. But you can see what the numbers are. And then finally, family support, which I talked about, both our Military One Source, our military family life counselors, and we do have family support assistance programs for Guard and Reserve as well, not just active duty. Okay? That gives you a more of a graphical depiction of who we are and what we do. Very quickly, we changed the mission. Take a look at that. Much more active. Notice the word empower. We are Americans at the end of the day. Empower. Pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps, but also making sure we've got support for our wounded warriors and our family members who do need it. But we also want to have programs that empower. Take a look at that last word, to thrive. Not just resilience, but this notion of thriveness. You know, especially as we move out of these wars and back into a community that's a very 21st century one. How do we think about that? Take a look at the vision. It is the Department of Defense at the end of the day. We do have planes. We do have ships. We have tanks, but we have people. And the argument here, when my team looked at how to change that vision, was that people are more important than ever to the mission of the Department of Defense. And you got to be tenacious See that word? You got to be tenacious in the Department of Defense to ensure that you are protecting the kinds of programs and making and working the kinds of programs that will ensure the people power you need for the Defense Department to meet its mission. People-focused, people-centric, people always, and some touchstone values as well. New mission, new vision. And these are the strategic imperatives. Now take a look at each one of these three. The first one is this notion of the alignment of human capital. We are in the 21st century. It is a different age. It is not tomorrow, but it is today. How do we prepare our people for that? Yes, we want to ensure that our families are resilient. We want to ensure that our families have a quality of life that affects readiness and retention of the force, but intrinsically, in terms of our military community being ready to fulfill who they are in a 21st century, we've got to understand the impact and develop the programs around education and employment and health. And we have a multi-generational force. Most of our force is your age. They're millennials. Really? How do we think about that? In terms of outreaching to them? In terms of providing a quality of life? In terms of an exchange of information so that we're responsive to their needs and can hear them? It is a multi-generational force. Establishing social capital. At the end of the day, trust building. How do you build trust within the department and with other agencies, with the White House, with your stakeholders, to ensure you can get to the hard work? You know, that takes work. People just don't automatically trust you, especially in agencies. You've got to build that. It takes time. You've got to develop those relationships. You've got to get out of that office. And there's a science and an art to it. So we focused on that. Transparency, as much as we can with the media as well. And we can talk about that during the Q&A. Respect for others, for your office, for people, for other agencies, for other stakeholders as well. And then this notion of partnerships. I wanted to hit upon that. It gets back to this, the normative versus the positive. What should the Department of Defense be responsible for? My argument here is it does take a community to effectively care for, support, and empower a military community, since 70% are off installation. What are the right partnerships? How do you activate those? How do you get legislative relief from old laws that may be out of step with a current environment, right? So you have to work with Congress as well. We are very fortunate, for example, to have the First Lady as a mouthpiece, of course, for a military community. Some of you know joining forces. And she's out there pitching in terms of partnerships and the kinds of programs that can work in our community. So these are what we call the strategic imperatives in terms of how we do our work. The strategic lens to create programs, to provide policy oversight as well. I'm going to go through this quickly. These are some of the priorities right now. Spousal education, I mentioned basically that unemployment rate for spouses is 26%, military spouses. Wage gap of 25% between them and their civilian counterparts. They want to work. We have roughly 1.2 million spouses. We created a program, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, with corporate America, not only that, other employers, to get them employed. We're doing some really interesting things around education as well. Comprehensive transformation of education. Just finished an education review for all 1.2 million of our military children. 1.1 million of the 1.2 million are in our public schools across the United States. They are not in the Department of Defense education system. 87,000 are. Then there is another educational delivery system that people don't know about. It's called Public Schools on Military Installations. 160 of them. I'll tell you about that in a minute. That's what that chart is about. And we've been focused on assessing and evaluating those schools and getting at fixing them. More to come on that. So, education review, fixing public schools, tuition assistance for active duty service members, and we do have a small program called My Career Advancement Account for our junior spouses, spouses of junior service members. They can get up to $4,000 basically to finish and get credentialed, an associate's degree, or a license as well. Successful program. Then finally, military family wellness. A lot of things going on there in terms of, I talked about Military One Source, our inflict program. We're doing some really interesting things with child care. We're partnering with 13 states to increase the capacity of child care off installation. 98% of child care facilities on installation are accredited. Only 10% of child care facilities off installation are accredited. So we're working very closely with those states. It's one of those partnerships we plan to expand over time. So, gives you an idea basically of the high priority initiatives. And I just had to put this on. You know, the issue network. This is something I carried from the Wilson School. Anytime we have an issue, you know, I have my team do an issue network. Who are the stakeholders at the end of the day? Right? The policy researchers, the media, interest groups, think tanks, government actors, congressional committees. Who do we have to deal with? Who do we outreach to? Who do we exchange information with? Who's going to affect what we do? We do use issue networks at the end of the day. What's interesting about the military community, very few think tanks focused on military community issues. Big opportunity here. Currently, the Center for a New American Security is working closely with the White House on joining forces. So we're seeing more research being done. But let me tell you, huge opportunity right here with think tanks, looking at the military community, everything from stress to well-being to health, a lot more issues on the table. Education, employment, but you can see here an example of an issue network associated with what we do. Okay, let's get to the case studies. How am I doing for time? Good, okay, because I want plenty of time for Q&A. I'm going to do 2 case studies. First one's fascinating. Didn't even know about this myself. I just knew there were a few schools in this category. And I'm going to pass some charts around that will show you the school systems that I just discussed and give you this policy case study as something to chew on. Maybe we can get a little bit of interaction. Okay, 1.2 million military-connected children who are school age. Fact. Fact. 194 schools, 87,000 military children in the Department of Defense education activity. Worldwide, right? It's a worldwide school system, okay? Fact, 1.1 million military-connected children in public schools in the United States. Where are the rest of them? About a delta of 80,000, right? 75 to 80,000. They're in public schools on military installations. I'll say that again. These are public schools. These are run by school district superintendents. But they sit on military installations. Where the heck did they come from? 1950, Department of Education, there was a public law that when, indeed, a locality could not or did not support military children's education, the Department of Education could establish basically a school. And they established a number of them that they operated and they owned. Now what I will do is I'm going to pass you around a chart. This is the same chart. I'm going to start over here. And what you're going to see on here are Department of Defense education schools in the Americas, in Europe, and the Pacific. Again, 194 schools, 87,000. But if you look in the upper left quadrant, these are public schools on military bases. You'll notice 59 bases across the country have these public schools, begun by the Department of Education. Around the 1950s, interestingly enough, again, right here, and you can see where these schools are across the country. Well, initially Department of Education ran them, but over time, based on law, there was a transfer of ownership of these schools to public school districts. Now, some people ask, why in the world that you have public schools and military installations in the first place? Easy way to integrate them back then, in the 1950s. You would just put those schools on military land, interestingly enough. But over time, the transference of ownership went to public school districts. Again, still sat on military installations. We have 160 of these schools today. 21 of the 160 are still owned by the Department of Education. One owned by the Army. The rest owned by LEA, local education activities. And here's the hook. They're all operated by local education activities. Here's the first question. We live in American federalism. Who's responsible, basically, for the recapitalization of those schools? Is it the local school district? Or is it the federal government? Who's responsible for fixing it?
Local schools.
Local schools. 75,000 of the 80,000 kids are military kids in those schools. Still local. Okay, 5,000 of them, of those children, are civilians. Who's responsible? So this question got asked for 50, 60 years. And couldn't figure it out. Again, not run by the Department of Defense, run by the Department of Education. And if you took a look at public law, a section of the public law, basically 81-815 and 81-874, operations and maintenance and reconstruction, different sections. Section 6 schools were DoD schools. It was clear who was responsible, the Department of Defense for recapitalization. But then there were 3 other sections, Section 5, Section 10, and Section 14, interestingly enough, that set initially the Department of Education as responsible, but didn't appropriate any money. Now, there was some money, again, that was authorized, but there was some money appropriated for emergencies. Folks, 60 years. We're going back to the 1950s. I did some research on this, and sure enough, there were 2 studies done, one in 1987, one in 1994, that this was an issue, that we had these schools. Over time, you could see the transference of ownership from the Department of Education to local school districts, but no money was coming with it. The studies were done. The studies looked at capacity and condition and age and changing local laws, for example. And the fact that these schools needed to be attended to, but they weren't. Let's fast forward to 2010. And again, this was begun back in 1950s. My boss, Dr. Stanley, wanted to conduct an education review. So we did. We basically looked at, and it was 2-part, a review of our military children's education, transitions and deployments, STEM, early childhood development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a second part to that, evaluation of our public schools on military installations. An evaluation and assessment had already occurred for DoDEA schools. So, I was responsible for the education review. We deployed engineers out to each one of those schools and assessed them based on condition, capacity, and age. Okay? Now, we rated them Q1, good, through Q4, bad, red. In terms of condition, C1, good, green, through C4, bad, not enough capacity based on the influx of military children. And we were able to rank order these schools. Okay? Of course, a red school was #1 on the list. A green school further down on the list. 160 of them. Meanwhile, through Congress, there were some congressional members concerned about these schools in their districts and were pushing for appropriating money to the tune of $250 million of no-year money. Now, for you students of public policy, that means you don't have to spend it before the next fiscal year. You've got time, basically, to come up with a plan to revitalize these schools. Sure enough, we did get an appropriation for $250 million. Now, notice I didn't say an authorization. Remember, there are 2 parts in Congress. You can get authorized, but that doesn't mean you get any money, and then appropriate. Well, this went through the appropriations process and not the authorizations process. So we had to find authorizations with the appropriation that we just got in terms of $250 million. But in the building, what was fascinating was A, the policy development for these schools, B, then how we were going to rank order the schools, and C, and this is what I want to pose to the group, what skin in the game should the public schools have? Now, there were some who thought $250 million is the Department of Defense money. We should deploy to those schools and fix those schools. 1, 2, 3, right in sequence. On the other side, we should have a 50-50 match. The Department of Defense, 50%. The public schools, 50% in terms of the money. And with a 50-50 match, the money would go further. What do you think? How would you argue if you're in the room? And literally, this is what public policy is all about. A bunch of folks sitting around the table figuring out what the match should be. What skin in the game should the public school districts have? Should. It's a normative. What do you think? How do you think about the issue? Again, in terms of American federalism, education is local in this country. The Department of Defense now has $250 million. It can apply to public schools on military installations, most of the students who are military children. 160 schools, and we all know in this room that $250 million is not going to get to all of those schools. What do you think? What would you say? Zero match? 50-50? 25%? Any thoughts? Yes?
I go 50-50.
50-50. And we had a lot on that side. We had some who said, this is the day of the internet. You can find out the master plan of schools on the internet. You don't need the 50-50 match. We know exactly how much money, or roughly, that they're going to be putting towards school revitalization. We settle on 20%. And we can talk later about that settling, but
20%.
20% match. So if a school needs $10 million for its reconstruction, basically the school comes up with $2 million, and the Department of Defense takes $8 million, basically, out of the $250 for that school. Yes?
One equation for every school?
Yes, although it could be waived. Could be waived. Now, that 20% does not supplant a current school master plan. So in other words, if a school's master plan already showed it could contribute 38%, then it had to do so. So what we did was we devised a federal evaluation team. You saw my org chart. I had that senior advisor on the upper right. He sits on that federal evaluation team. They go out to every single one of those schools, basically. They sit down with the school superintendent staff and with the installation commander. They look at the master plan. They talk through it to see, indeed, what should the federal government, put into the school revitalization. And once that's agreed upon, then the school can submit for an E-grant, and that's how it is then reimbursed for the money. That's how it works. But we came up with 20%. It's a fascinating study in public policy. To sit in the room and contribute and try to figure out what the match should be within the auspices of a system of American federalism at the end of the day. And the fact that education is local, but in this case you had public schools on military installations with primarily military kids, with the Defense Department with an appropriation of $250 million. Question?
I mean, if this solution was 60 years in coming, is there a plan now for how we go ahead, as opposed to trying to ad hoc it?
Good question. So we now have $500 million. And in the Department of Defense, we are considering that very thing. And it gets back to the normative. Should the Department of Defense continue to maintain these schools in perpetuity? I can tell you it's still a discussion, interestingly enough. It's an interesting discussion in terms of trying to figure out who should have responsibility for these schools. 160 of them across the country. Because as we know, sooner or later, the ones that are yellow or green will become red at the end of the day. And it's a continuing discussion.
Could you clarify just
Yes.
one thing?
Yes.
A military child that goes to a school, the Department of Defense will pay that school the equivalent of the tax revenue of the parents that ordinarily wouldn't pay for their property taxes that would go into those schools.
Not quite. Good question. It usually isn't quite the equivalent. And it's determined not by school, but by school district. So a school, for example, could have 98% military kids in a school, one of the schools in the school district. But that doesn't mean the school is going to get funding for all 98%. That 98% is added to the overall percentage of military kids in the school district. That will determine what we call impact aid money. Impact aid money. And the school must achieve a percentage of 19.5% or more military kids in a school district to qualify for DoD impact aid. Now, the Department of Education also has impact aid for military connected kids as well. But it's an interesting, fascinating study of public policy in determining a support for kids who meander from one school system to the other. Perfect example, me, military brat, 3 high schools. Augsburg American High School, DODEA, Department of Defense Education Activity, Augsburg, Germany, freshman and sophomore year. Junior year, Fort Carson, Colorado, Fountain Fort Carson, public school on a military installation. Graduated from a public high school, Palmer High School, Colorado Springs, Colorado. 3 different high schools. Same with my sister, my brother went to 4. Interestingly enough. But it's the story of military children as they meander basically from school system to school system. And what you try to do, of course, and this is a question we can talk about later, the degree to which the Department of Defense should be involved in education. What we hope to do is assure a quality education through the military lifestyle of military children at the end of the day. This is one issue that we wrestle with, the education of 1.2 million military children. Okay, how am I doing for time?
You got about 5 minutes to cover the last issue.
5 minutes to cover the last issue. Question?
Is the curriculum the same for the public schools on a military installation as in the rest of the
It
community?
is not. As you can imagine, the curriculum is different all over the place. There are some school districts who have a common core. In the Department of Defense Education Activity, we just adopted the common core. So we're coming up with very innovative ways to ensuring that our kids, and our kids actually do well in our military kids in terms of testing, but especially with 10 years of war, there have been some effects on social-emotional learning, as you might imagine, and there's some studies to show that. And our Department of Defense Education Activity is currently looking at how to improve its curriculum right now. Yes?
In the next 10 years with these appropriation cuts, are you expecting a significant decrease in number of students, say, at the end of 10 years?
You know, we already know in the Army, for example, it's going down by roughly 80,000 service members. So you can imagine that there will be a decrease in the number of family members as well. So we are, the Marines, for example, will go from, what is it, like 182,000 from 202. So roughly 20,000. So there's a requisite decrease in the number of family members too. We're taking a look at those numbers. Of course, we're looking at where the force will be deployed or making some assumptions on that in the future as well. And trying to make those policy decisions. But yes, the assumption is with the reduction, we will probably see a reduction in the number of families too. Good question. Okay, before we get to the Q&A, let me posit one more thing to you in terms of, once again, the normative. What should the Department of Defense be responsible for versus what it is? Spouses, 1.2 million, 735,000 active duty, spouses of active duty personnel. Roughly about 400,000 are spouses of reserve and guard. One word, right? Global economy. Most of them millennials. Okay. So, question is 26% unemployment rate, 25% wage gap between military spouses who are educated and their civilian counterparts. What to do? That's the challenge set. So, this is interesting. The Army had a program called the Army Spouse Employment Program, where they partnered with Fortune 500 companies, and those Fortune 500 companies agreed to give military spouses a fair shake. They had a website, military spouses could go to that website and see what job opportunities were available. It's not that there was preferential treatment, they could compete, but at least there was a portal where they could find jobs. When I first got to the Pentagon back in July of 2010, I would ask senior leaders, if there's one thing that you wish you had that you don't have now, what it would be. And you know what they said, almost to a person? They said, time to learn from the other services. We don't have that time. So we started a program called Service to Service. It was at the Deputy Manpower and Reserve Affairs level, 2-star, where we brought the services together to share some best practices. And sure enough, the Army shared about the military, the Army Spouse Employment Program. And it was at that meeting that the other services heard about that program and agreed in principle that we wanted to expand it across the Department of Defense. It was fascinating. I know I have a few minutes and we can get into it in the Q&A. We currently now have the Military Spouse Employment Program. 96 partners, CVS, Caremark to Citigroup to others, also small businesses, some academic institutions, a part of the medical community as well, who provide jobs on a website, www.imsetjobs.com. We have had over 250,000 jobs on that website since June the 29th. We have now 15,000 plus spouses employed through the program. But it was really a manifestation of how the services could partner, first of all, with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and then stakeholders in a broader community to provide jobs for spouses. And not only that, not jobs, but careers. Because the MSET program has a memorandum of understanding, and each of the partners signs that MOU to A, offer telework portable job, B, mentor other future MSET partners. We hope to sign up another 25 on the 17th of May this year. C, to offer data at the end of the day on the spouses who are being hired, and the data in terms of as they move from place to place, whether they continue employment or not. It gets to that third strategic imperative about partnership. So we plan to build on it. The First Lady talks about this quite a bit in terms of empowering our spouses, and it is an example of public policy in terms of partnership and innovation. And at the end of the day, it's about information too. How you share and take time to share information where a good idea can become good public policy. I'm going to stop there so we have plenty of time for questions. Hopefully I've put enough on the table for you to think about. I'm just delighted and I feel privileged to have served our military community in this position. I worked with a bunch of great folks. And I can just tell you, woos, you know, you'll be following me and Colonel Meese in the future, and it's an exciting, challenging, interesting world in which we operate as woos, and we can't wait to hand the mantle to you. Thanks again, everybody.